Welcome, everybody. It is a real pleasure to be here today. My name is Galia Moran, and it is really a delight to be here both as a representative of the Department of Social Work at Ben-Gurion University, opening up our series of yearly departmental talks, and doing this in collaboration as a representative of ISPRA, the Israeli Psychiatric Rehabilitation Association, to host Professor Mike Slade with us. Both the Social Work Department of Ben-Gurion and ISPRA share very similar orientations and values, so this comes really natural to us. And we are really delighted to have Professor Mike Slade give us a talk very soon. I'm going to present Mike, and after that, Taya from ISPRA will give a few technical explanations about the subtitles, and then wholeheartedly we'll plunge into the lecture. So Professor Mike Slade is a professor of mental health recovery and social inclusion at the University of Nottingham. His main research interests are recovery-focused and outcome-focused mental health services, including recovery colleges, lived experience narratives, citizen science, well-being, needs assessment, and developing measures. He has written over 300 academic articles and published 15 books, including Personal Recovery and Mental Illness, Partnering for Recovery in Mental Health, Positive Psychotherapy for Psychosis, Well-Being Recovery and Mental Health, and Camberwell Assessment of Needs. His 15 free booklets include Making Recovery a Reality, 100 Ways to Support Recovery, Refocus, Promoting Recovery in Community Mental Health Services, and the Empirical Evidence About Recovery, The Business Case of Recovery, and more, all downloadable at researchintorecovery.com site. So as you can see already, what we will hear today is only the tip of the icebergs of what Professor Mike Slade has to give in terms of knowledge and expertise over the years in this field. And I encourage everybody to look more into the researchintorecovery.com website and to download these free downloadable booklets and other materials. Before we begin with Mike, Taya, would you like to give a few technical explanations? And the way it's going to work is we are planning in a 1-hour lecture by Professor Slade. And if you have questions, please write them in the chat. We will not interrupt Professor Slade during the talk. And right after that, we'll be very, very happy to collect questions and read them out or call on to you to just have your questions directly heard to Mike. Taya.
שלום לכולם, שמי תאיה, אני רכזת איספרה, ברוכים הבאים למפגש. אם מישהו עדיין לא הסתדר, אז בתחתית המסך של הזום אתם יכולים לראות שתי אותיות CC, אפשר ללחוץ עליהם ואז ללחוץ על show subtitles כדי שתוכלו לראות את התרגום הסימולטני לעברית שיש כרגע. התרגום יהיה לאורך כל המפגש. חשוב שתשימו לב שהמפגש מוקלט, ובהמשך הוא גם יפורסם בערוץ היוטיוב של איספרה. ולגבי השאלות, כמו שפרופסור גליה מורן אמרה, אז אתם מוזמנים לשאול את השאלות במהלך ההרצאה דרך הצ'אט. אתם יכולים לשלוח את השאלות אליי, אני ארכז את השאלות, ואני אעביר אותם לפרופסור גליה מורן, ובסוף ההרצאה יהיה גם חלק לשאלות, אז תוכלו לשאול ישירות, זה לבחירתכם. אם יש איזשהם שאלות טכניות או משהו לא ברור, אתם מוזמנים לשלוח אליי כל הזמן שאלות, אני זמינה כאן. תודה רבה. גליה, אלייך.
Okay, so I think, Mike, without further ado, we can invite Mike, Taya, to start the presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the very warm welcome. My only regret is that I cannot be in your lovely country. I was last there in Tel Aviv in June, meeting many friends and colleagues from Israel, and I look forward to my next visit in person. But here we are meeting online.
Yep.
So can I check that screen is coming up okay, Galia?
It looks fine to me. Taya,
Yeah.
is it okay on your side?
Yes, it's fine.
Wonderful. So do mention if there's any technical problems. But so hello to everyone. So I sit in England at the University of Nottingham, home of Robin Hood, and we have a research group which is focused on a range of areas, all relating to recovery, social inclusion, well-being, if you like, the general idea of supporting people with mental health issues to live the life that they want to live as well as possible, to live in a way that is connected to others, to have a life beyond illness. And I know that's very consistent with the approach in Israel in terms of the basket of rehabilitation goods. So I'm hoping there will be real crossovers in the research we do here in England and that may have relevance in Israel. However, looking at the title, Transforming Mental Health Services, those of you who have worked in the mental health system for a while will know that the idea of transformation is nothing new. I mean, I've worked in the mental health system for many years, and we're always innovating, transforming, updating, improving, and yet somehow things stay the same. And so my first point in formulating this title is we need to be really thoughtful about what transforming means, transforming towards what? Because my suggestion is that too often in the past, the idea of transforming has been understood to mean developing the next treatment, the next intervention, the next thing to do to that group over there, the next thing to fix them or to cure them or to treat them. And actually, I think a modern understanding of transformation is a deeper process than just developing the next treatment. It is about organizational and system change. It is about changing the culture, changing the embedded assumptions on the various actors, the various stakeholders in the mental health system. It speaks to what is the job of a mental health worker. It speaks to what do we expect of people who are clients or consumers or service users or patients. It speaks to what is the role of the family. So what I'm talking about in this talk is not let's develop the next intervention. It is a deeper question about how we transform systems of health and social care towards ones that support a focus on rights, a focus on individualized care, and a focus on supporting recovery within and beyond the mental health system. So we are grappling in this talk with big issues. It is not going to be a talk about the latest treatment. So how do we have a compass, a direction finder for this idea of transformation? And I think modern thinking is very clear. What we need is a compass that is around rights. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is global human rights legislation. So it relates to, in rights language, often the term used is people with psychosocial disabilities, but that includes what in the mental health system we would call people living with mental health issues. So this is a global piece of legislation which was adopted about 16 years ago by the United Nations. It has been ratified by almost all countries. So both your country and mine, for example, have ratified the CRPD, which means that the countries are saying they will abide by this human rights legislation in the way they work with people with disabilities. Now, just in case it's of interest, who are the countries that didn't ratify it? There are two groups. One group is of failed states that do not have a health infrastructure or are in civil war and so forth. So that's the larger group. The other group has only one country in it, which is the United States of America, which did not ratify the CRPD linked to issues about exceptionalism in America. So nearly all countries, and certainly yours and mine, have ratified the CRPD. So what does that talk about? Well, here is a word cloud of the concepts that are talked about in the human rights legislation that forms the backbone for this talk. And as you can see, they are issues that we will all recognize: the idea of liberty and access, and being having freedom, being treated with respect, having a full experience of participation. And I like the big word in the middle, just having a life that other people would recognize as, yeah, that's a life that's fair and reasonable, and the person is not constrained by the wider environment in a way that other citizens are not. So I'm hoping that we can have a view that the kind of things talked about in the CRPD legislation are very much the things that all of us as citizens would recognize. It is not some strikingly different proposal for people with living with disabilities. So that's the good news. The bad news is that all countries in the world that have signed up to or ratified the CRPD are currently non-compliant. They do not follow this legislation, this human rights treaty that has been signed up to by their country. So there is a global problem. That's true in Israel, that's true in the United Kingdom, that's true in all of the countries that have ratified this human rights legislation, that the mental health and social care system does not align with rights legislation. And this is in one way the transformation that I'll be talking about in this talk, of how do we move from the current assumptions embedded in the mental health system towards, and ideally achieving, a system that is rights oriented. So we have work that has gone on internationally. This has been led by the World Health Organization. They have developed an approach called the Quality Rights Toolkit. And this is an approach for awareness raising and training across regions and countries about what human rights are, how they are enacted, and what specifically the mental health system needs to do to be CRPD compliant. So the training involves some core modules, which are shown there. So helping people to understand what human rights are, helping people to understand issues of capacity and so forth, and then specialized modules, for example, about dealing with issues of control and compulsion, seclusion and restraint, supporting advanced planning. So this is the Quality Rights Toolkit. Now, this was developed a number of years ago and has been used at national and regional level in a number of countries around the world. So there have been a number of publications really trying to pick out what the issues are. But of course, awareness is not enough. What we need is change. And again, the World Health Organization has really led this process by the development of a fantastic new resource that came out very recently called the Quality Rights e-Training. So unlike the Quality Rights Toolkit, which is to understand at the national or regional level, this Quality Rights e-Training is for individual people. So it's primarily targeted at workers, but also relevant to people using mental health services and people who are family members of people using services. So I've done this training. It's very good. I fully recommend it as a thing for each person on this call to consider doing. It's a high quality, engaging and interesting and useful training program. And the WHO has put a lot of resources into this training. They have a target of 5 million people around the world having completed it by the end of 2024. And they're providing significant support towards that target. So I think this is a new and exciting innovation, which is exactly intended to shift the basic understanding within the mental health and social care system towards one which is more completely understanding and orienting systems around a rights orientation. So this is one resource that is free to use and I recommend. There are other global resources. So for example, last year, the World Health Organization issued guidance on community mental health services. They have a number of what they call technical packages, which is other documents that are available. So the one on the left is the main guidance, and the others on the right are also downloadable from the WHO website for free. These are very useful. They provide a very global perspective, which often is missing in national work or national policy, around best practice internationally in supporting people's recovery journey, and as they put on the booklet, promoting person-centered and rights-based approaches. So again, I recommend this package. So more broadly, this work, the guidance on community mental health services, is embedded in a longer standing strand of work that the World Health Organization have led around a global action plan. And there has been a consistent emphasis in this on the idea of human rights being central, culturally appropriate care being provided, with a focus on promoting recovery and participation in the community and addressing community issues such as stigma and discrimination. So there are a lot of resources which I commend to you. These are all high quality, very thought through resources that are all free to access. So in some ways, one might have a view of, oh, well, you know, everything is going very well. But there is another discourse going on in the mental health system which suggests that things are not going so well. So here is the 2020 report of the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Mental Health and Human Rights. And in his report, he identifies that people using services have a number of very challenging issues they face. Oh, excuse me. He identifies widespread, multiple, intersecting and aggravated issues, and you can read for yourself the rights violations which he identifies. In particular, and perhaps most challenging, is not just society has bad attitudes and stigmatizes and discriminates, but the system itself is too oriented towards institutionalization, towards over-medicalization, and doing treatments to the person that do not respect their autonomy. So to put this within a biomedical ethics concept, the proposal here is that there is too much of a focus on a duty of care, that we have a duty as workers to treat people, and too little emphasis on the other biomedical ethical imperatives of promoting autonomy and supporting justice. So whilst we have a number of resources, this is arguing that actually there are many human rights violations that continue. So you might think, oh, well, that is the case in other settings, but not in our countries. Our countries are doing very well. And the problem is the empirical evidence does not bear that out. So this is a paper published this year in the world's highest impact factor psychiatry journal. And it was a survey of over 30 countries looking at how helpful individuals using services found the worker that they were working with. And sadly, only 1/4 of people who used mental health services said that they were helped by the first person they saw. So this is a challenge because quite clearly in other areas of life, be it other areas of medicine or other spaces where we consult a professional, such as in law, the idea that 3 in 4 first encounters do not lead to the help that is needed is clearly not acceptable. So services are not oriented sufficiently around the needs of the individual and their preferences and their values. So we do have an ongoing problem in our countries. So what is the way forward from this? My formulation, my suggestion is that there are 2 sorts of knowledge which are relevant to mental health care. There is the knowledge of professionals, which has been built up over many years and is often exemplified by clinical judgment, but includes guidelines, includes all the randomized controlled trial and systematic review evidence, all of the knowledge that has accrued through health research and refinement and replication of findings. That is important knowledge. But the second type of knowledge, the knowledge of the individual, both at the individual level and collectively, the knowledge of expertise by experience, is insufficiently developed and visible within the mental health system. So to bring this distinction to life, I want to give an example of COVID. I would send my sympathies to everyone who, like me, has lost loved ones to this awful disease. But I think there are lessons to learn here when we look at the global picture in relation to COVID. The lesson is that there is no single perspective which, even in a pandemic crisis, should dominate all other perspectives. Clearly, different countries have adopted different approaches, from very open settings with a focus on vaccination to, I think of China, for example, with a very focus on zero COVID policy. Different countries in Europe have focused on different levels of social distancing restrictions, different approaches to vaccine rollout, different tolerance of anti-vax protests, and so forth. There have been different responses in different countries to balance the need for safety for citizens whilst reducing the loss of rights of citizens. So there is no one size fits all. So turning back to the focus of this lecture, what that highlights to me is that we need to have strong professional expertise, knowledge one, but we also need to have that balanced by strong emphasis on identifying and harnessing expertise by experience, or knowledge two. If we have knowledge one dominating, then what we end up with is a system which is subject to the criticisms we have talked about, where experiences are over-medicalized, coercion and compulsion is the norm, and people's rights are routinely violated. So for me, the antidote to that is to increase the importance attached to expertise by experience. So that means not getting rid of, but rather rebalancing the knowledge equation between knowledge one, professional knowledge, and knowledge two, expertise by experience. So I want to go on now that we've established a compass, a direction indicator for the transformation we're looking to achieve, to just tell you about three approaches which we're using in our research group to work towards this ambitious goal of transformation. So the three approaches are citizen science, approaches to support staff to better support recovery in the people they're working with, and more recent innovation using lived experience narratives as an approach to benefiting other people living with mental health issues. So to start with citizen science, this is a new approach within mental health. It is not widely used. So just to understand, it is an approach that is increasingly used in natural sciences research. So in particular, you may know citizen science from ecological research. So if you've ever been involved in projects where you count the birds in your garden, or the strength of the wind, or anything that is about the natural world, and as a citizen science contributor, you feed that into a wider data set, then you'll have been a citizen scientist yourself. So many people on the call may have had that experience. There are many projects that are taking place around the world. So SciStarter is a place that projects are recorded, and they've identified the most joined in 2021 citizen science projects here. And you can see that most of them are to do with the natural world. Those that are to do with related to mental health, such as Project 11, have a focus on neuroscience and understanding brain scans rather than understanding lived experience. So far, there hasn't been a big use of citizen science in relation to mental health, but it has been very widely used in some other areas. So, for example, here in England, we had a citizen science study by a company called Zoe, and the Zoe app was downloaded by around about 10% of the population in England, and was used to provide the primary data to understand the spread of COVID and the development of new symptoms of COVID across the population. So this example of citizen science was a game changer in the United Kingdom approach to managing the challenges of the pandemic. And it was only a game changer because so many people took part in it. So there is something about citizen science that is a step change in participation towards mass participation. So in this context, 4.5 million people in England. So that's citizen science as a whole. What just to sort of understand what we're talking about when we talk about citizen science, this is science that is conducted as a collaboration between scientists or researchers, people like myself, and everyday citizens. And those everyday citizens may be contributors. There may be people who provide some data that wouldn't be accessible to the scientist. There may be collaborators who work with the scientists to, for example, develop the approaches to analysing the data. Or there may be project leaders who bring a perspective on new priorities which are not so visible to the researcher. And so that's the role. And the key thing is that citizen science projects are genuine science. They are not just things created to answer questions that we already know. They are genuine science addressing questions that we cannot access or cannot address through traditional research approaches. So that's what citizen science is. So we have been funded with a study which is called CSTACS, and that has just started this year. And the goal, the aim of CSTACS is to bring citizen science approaches to mental health. So why do we think this might be a useful and innovative thing to do? Well, in English, a sea stack is one of these, a rock that stands on its own in the sea, and the gap between the rock and the mainland has been eroded away by the water. So you end up with a single sea stack, which you can see in the picture. So this represents the land mass is knowledge 1, and the sea stack is knowledge 2. The individual and their values, their preferences, their goals, their dreams, their ambitions, their strengths. That's the individual knowledge, which is currently insufficiently focused on. But of course, sea stacks are interesting because they don't just occur on their own. They also occur in groups. And we can start to see this metaphor come to life of how citizen science may contribute to mental health if we think about sea stacks of many shapes and sizes, some broken, some very perfectly formed, each being individual voices which collectively create a new body of knowledge. So citizen science has the potential to understand and for the first time create a new type of knowledge, knowledge 2. And one approach which we're hoping to do is to engage tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands of individuals in creating collective new knowledge about the experience of mental health issues from the inside rather than the traditional focus of observing from the outside. So that's why the study is called CSTACS. So we started by looking at platforms, and there are many platforms around the world, none specific in Israel that we've identified, but there are many multinational platforms, and I mention those here in case people want to have a look at them. And generally these are all free projects to undertake on each platform, so you might choose to get involved in something that interests you. So in CSTACS, the platform we'll be using is the United Kingdom one, because there are particular local advantages, and that platform is called Zooniverse. So this is a platform run by the University of Oxford, and we will be doing 2 proof of concept projects, which I'll explain in a moment. So underpinning that though, as is right and proper in any health research, is a systematic review. So we've identified, at the moment, only 9 published studies in relation to citizen science and mental health. So I'm hoping those of you who are attending this call will have a real sense that you were in at the start, at the birth of a new academic discipline. Because my sense is that citizen science in mental health has the potential to revolutionize our understanding of what knowledge means and what kinds of knowledge are useful and accessible in relation to mental health, by providing a mechanism for accessing knowledge to expertise by experience on a mass scale, which has not been done before. And there's a real journey to go. So the European Citizen Science Association has identified 10 principles, and these are the guiding principles that are now established internationally as showing best practice in citizen science. And one of the principles is about public availability of data. None of the mental health related studies we have included in our systematic review have made the data publicly available. And of course, there may be reasons for that. It may be that individual contributors are quite happy to make public how many birds they counted in their back garden, but may be much less happy to have personal information about their mental health made public. So there may or may not be good reasons, but there is clearly a journey to go on understanding what public availability of data means in the context of mental health. Similarly, who owns the data and how the data, if it is to be shared, will be shared, is very much at the early stages of work. So one of our things we're doing in the systematic review, which is in preparation at the moment, is identifying proposed best practice for citizen science and mental health to address some of these issues. And an example difference would be in standard citizen science, an individual signs up to a citizen science platform and chooses a project to do and then just does it. Our view is that in mental health, given the subject matter, we need to consider informed consent for projects as well. So that will be one area that we envisage deviating from current standard practice in citizen science because of the mental health topic. So we're going to do 2 proof of concept studies. And the first is really looking to develop new innovation in the system. So what we will do in this envisioning recovery study is we will have some story hubs or starts of story. So for example, the story might be Sam starts to feel quite low and starts to hear voices which are saying bad things about Sam. Sam goes to their family doctor and talks about the issues that they're experiencing, and then ... And what we ask is citizen science contributors to tell some of the rest of the story to illustrate, without starting from where we are, but if we had the chance to restart mental health support, what would really, really good, rights-oriented, recovery-oriented, person-centered mental health support look like? What would happen? And our sense is that this will provide a storehouse of innovation, which can inform emerging policy and practice. So this is the opportunity to bring real innovation in terms of genuinely new ideas into the mental health system, rather than simply just iterations of what we know already being a bit more refined and a bit more accessible and so forth. So this is the disruptive transformation proof of concept study. That is likely to have longer term benefits. So we're also doing a second proof of concept study, which is intended to have an immediate benefit. So one of the challenges in the mental health system is there is an awful lot of knowledge, one, about advice to support people to live well, to look after themselves, to have well-being, to have reduced impact of symptoms and so forth. Nearly all of that knowledge comes from the perspective of experts, clinicians, workers, people like me. It doesn't come from the perspective of people living with mental health issues. And we know almost nothing at the mass scale of how people in their everyday lives get through the day. We know how people, what advice we give. But just as an example, one of the common things that a clinician like myself would say to someone is, when you have a problem, it is better to address that problem than avoid it. To use the jargon, approach and active coping strategies are more effective than passive or avoidance coping strategies. Now that's all very well, and that's a clear message. But underpinning this proof of concept study is just the curiosity about whether that's true, whether actually many people, like, and when I think about in my personal life, I have challenges and I just try to avoid them and hope it will go away, and I do all those things that get me through the day. So I don't follow the advice that I would give someone else. And that's an intriguing question about whether actually that's a very common scenario, that people who are getting through the day living with mental health issues often have things they, for a short time or for a long time, choose not to address. And that may actually be a better strategy than constantly trying to address every issue that someone has. So that's one example of several, why we're very interested in how people actually live rather than how workers and the system thinks we should encourage and recommend people to live. So this will be, again, a goal of mass participation to understand people's everyday experiences and see where that differs from clinical advice. And it's not that one will be right and one will be wrong, but it will be very helpful, for example, in a mental health worker, to know, well, what the evidence of knowledge one type recommends is this, but actually a very large understanding of people who live with mental health issues suggests they do something slightly different. That may help the client, the consumer, to make a more informed choice about what's the right solution, the right approach for them. So this is an example of rebalancing the knowledge equation by making more visible knowledge too. So that's our work that is underway in relation to citizen science. The second strand I want to take you to is work which we completed, at least in terms of the work going on in Nottingham in the last decade. And this was a program grant, so a 5-year piece of work to really drill down and develop a well-resourced and good understanding of how workers can support recovery. And this stemmed from a recognition that in the mental health system traditionally, there's been a strong focus on interventions to reduce symptoms, to improve functioning, to make relapse less likely, all of which are very useful for some people at some points in their life. But there's been less of an emphasis on interventions to support people in a more positive way to live a life of their choosing, to live as well as possible, to experience recovery. So that distinction between the traditional focus on clinical recovery and the new, now globally agreed focus on personal recovery, the research hasn't kept up with how to support personal recovery. So this study was funded to address that. So in Refocus, the first thing we had to do was to identify what we mean by recovery, which proved to be a curiously difficult task. So we conducted a systematic review in which we identified that when you listen to the experience of people who have a personal experience of recovery, the themes that emerge from their narratives, from how they describe what they've experienced, you can identify 5 key recovery processes. So those 5 processes we call the CHIME framework, and they are around connectedness, hope, development of a more positive identity, support for meaning, and a focus on empowerment. Now, these are, as ever, things that, you might think, yes, of course, that's all good. But to think about the current approaches to mental health assessment, for example, where we spend an awful lot of time asking the individual what's wrong with them, much less of a focus on what they can do, what are their resources, what are their strengths, what are their goals, what are their aspirations. What we're inadvertently doing by that focus on what's wrong with the person is supporting the development of a negative identity. So we need to do even assessment processes differently if we're not to inadvertently get in the way of identity relating to recovery. So what do services do that make an impact on recovery? So we identified from a document analysis that best practice suggests that there are 4 basic things that a mental health and social care system do. So working from right to left, the first is that the support they offer can help individuals to recovery. But it's not just what they do, it's also how they do it. So the working relationship, the way that the worker works with a client, a consumer, or their family, that matters as well. That's not just the vehicle to provide the active ingredients of treatment, that is an active ingredient of treatment. And then we know that there are aspects of organizational culture which impact on how workers work with the people they're working with. So the organizational commitment to recovery is necessary for workers to be supporting recovery. So just as a concrete example, there is good empirical evidence that an organization that has a management style which is disempowering, which expects compliance passively from the workforce, which has bullying and other types of interpersonal problems in the organization, that will result in those same processes being present in the relationship between the worker and their client. So a disempowering organization creates disempowering workers. So the organizational culture matters. But because recovery does not happen just in the clinic or the hospital or the community service, recovery happens in wider life. The next frontier is around supporting the experience of citizenship in and beyond the mental health system. So that speaks to a wider remit for the mental health and social care system. So in Refocus, we focused on these 2 areas: what people do, how workers work, and what support they provide. Now, I'm hoping it's clear from the way I started this that the right place to start is not let's identify the interventions that are needed, but rather to identify the values. What is the purpose of the mental health system? And we propose that there are 3 values that need to be present for an organization, for a mental health system, to be recovery oriented. And the 3 are shown here, so I'll give you a moment to read them. And they may sound, again, like the kind of things, yeah, that sounds reasonable, but actually they're strong statements. So value 1, the primary goal, not the only goal, but the main goal is to support personal recovery. That can be a challenge to services that see their main goal as public protection, or services that see their main goal, as many chief executives of organizations tell me confidentially, their main goal is to keep their organization out of the newspapers. So these are not straightforward values. Nonetheless, they're values that we propose need to underpin a recovery-oriented service. So linked to that, what do we train people to, the workers, to do? The support for personal recovery, we train 3 things. Firstly, supporting people to understand the client, the consumer's values and treatment preferences. So not starting with what's wrong with you, but starting with who are you? So placing identity center stage. And linked to that, alongside the traditional expertise in the mental health system of assessing deficits, training workers to assess and amplify strengths that the individual has, which means that the responsibility moves away from the worker doing things to the person to fix them, and towards supporting the individual to strive towards goals of their own choosing. So the worker job becomes one of supporting goal striving rather than providing interventions to the person. So that's the working practices. That's the things we propose as useful for workers to do. But there is an international issue, so I've touched on it already, about how we avoid this idea of recovery just becoming the next thing that we do to them. So this might be an illustration of that issue. If we just blindly do the next great idea, how do we avoid that just repeating the mistakes of the past, where too often individuals have felt they are being told to do to be a good patient, to be a compliant patient, instead of supported to develop themselves? And the answer we landed on is that the interpersonal style used by the worker with the client needs to change to be focused more on the use of coaching. So coaching skills are based on the assumption that the coach does not have the best solution for the person. The job of the coach is to help the person to identify and implement the best solution for themselves. So it locates responsibility for change, not in the worker, but in the individual client. And this is really transformative. It changes the worldview that workers have from seeing clients as part of the problem to seeing them as part of the solution. And many workers told us this idea of using a different interpersonal style was transformative for their basic understanding of what their job is, for the type of experience they had when they had a client, a consumer, a service user sitting in front of them. So to summarize, refocus involves using coaching and with a focus on things that have not been the traditional focus in mental health assessment and treatment, values and preferences of the person, their strengths and their capacity to strive towards their personally valued goals. So all this is captured in an intervention manual, which is free to download and has been evaluated in a randomized control trial across England. And this was published in 2015. And what we found is that the refocused intervention essentially works when it's implemented. The challenge is implementation. And this finding has been replicated in a follow-up study conducted in Australia called Pulsar Refocus, which again published a paper in Lancet Psychiatry with a randomized control trial showing a similar result in an Australian context. So refocus is a valuable potential tool for implementation in services that are focused on cultural transformation within the service. If they're not focused on that, then you're sort of wasting your time because refocus with its radical new approaches won't be effectively implemented. So the third innovation I want to talk about is what we call NEON, narrative experiences online. And this is a study which is ongoing, but towards the end. So it had 3 goals, each of which have been achieved. So we wanted to create a collection of people's stories of recovery. We wanted to develop an approach to matching other people living with mental health issues to a story that might change them. And then finally, we wanted to evaluate that as an intervention in randomized control trials. So we've completed all of those 3 things. So just to start, what do we mean by a recovery story or a recovery narrative? These are stories that have 5 qualities. So the first is that they are told by the person themselves. So a recovery story is told by the individual, not by their carer or their worker or any other stakeholder. They include elements both of difficulty and of overcoming. The overcoming may be actually my life is very wonderful now, or it may be focused more on I am still here. I've had a very difficult time, I've experienced many traumas, and I'm still here. And that survival would be a form of overcoming. There must be some link to mental health problems, but many people choose to tell their stories and frame their experiences, not in relation to mental disorder, but in relation to other experiences such as trauma or as an experience of spiritual emergence. So we're very friendly to that full range of explanatory frameworks. And then finally, they must refer to something happening over time. So not just a snapshot, but it must be a story occurring over time. So this is our definition of recovery narrative. So based on that, we have worked with around 850 community organisations and a quarter of the mental health statutory services across England and in many other countries to collate and collect people's recorded recovery stories. So we do now have the world's largest collection in the NEON collection of recovery stories. We have about 800 stories and rising. People can donate their story on our website, which is has been a really useful source of more diverse stories. And many of those stories are people either telling a video of their story or doing some writing, a written version. But some are multimodal, some are people interspersing videos and podcasts with text. Some are just a picture. So this is a recovery story. I find this very moving, the idea of an albatross, a great weight around someone's neck, becoming free when they embrace it. For me, it speaks to me very directly. So there are many stories, and some of them are very positive about the contribution of mental health services to recovery. Some of them are very oppositional and essentially saying my recovery began when I disengaged from the mental health system. So we've been very thoughtful about not making this just marketing for how wonderful the mental health system is, but staying true to knowledge too, staying true to the lived experience of individuals, which are very diverse. So we've developed this into an intervention called the NEON intervention. And when people come to the website, the first thing that they can see is opportunities to learn about NEON, to hear testimonials from other people, to meet the NEON team, people like myself and all my colleagues who are behind NEON. All of this is important in any digital health intervention for increasing trustworthiness of the potential users of an intervention, so that there is a sense that this is a genuine website. When people log in, they go to this page, and at the top is the different ways of connecting to a story. So Match Me to a Story is what we recommend. And this is using a recommender system. So it's using for those who want the technical details, a collaborative and content-based hybrid filtering system. And essentially what it does is takes the experience of other people who are like the current user, finds the stories that those other people found helpful, and you considers recommending one of those stories to this service user, and also looks at other stories that this service user has found helpful and identifies a similar story and considers recommending that story, and combining those two algorithmic approaches makes a recommendation of a story to an individual, which is more likely than chance to be useful to that person. However, some people want to choose their story, so people can browse stories by category. Some people just want a random story, so that's an option, and people can store their stories to come back to. At the bottom, you'll see some things like badges are one of our approaches to gamification, which again is an approach to increasing engagement with stories. And you can see at the top an example of a badge that people get when they achieve certain milestones in using the intervention. So also in that box is About Me. This is where individuals over time can self-report more detailed information about who they are, and that improves the matching algorithm. But we know that initially people want to use an intervention anonymously, and only over time, as they build trust in the intervention, are they likely to want to provide more personal information. So that can be done over time. So we have conducted 3 randomized controlled trials. All of them have now finished. So these are the trial protocols. The trials opened in February 2020. Now, some of you may remember February 2020 is quite a big month in the history of humanity. That was when COVID pandemic started. So it has been a real challenge to deliver, although this is an online intervention, an intervention which is taking place in the context of such turbulence. Nonetheless, the amazing team working on the NEON trials have successfully completed 3 trials. So the NEON trial is for people with psychosis. So the people who are using the intervention, accessing the recovery stories, 744 people took part in that trial, and that's for people living with psychosis. We also did a second trial for people with other mental health issues called the NEON O trial, and that had over 1,000 participants. And then we did a smaller exploratory trial to understand whether the intervention might be helpful for family members and friends and informal carers as well. So those trials are all complete. They have led to new research directions, and just in finishing my lecture, I'm going to just mention some of those to show where we're going next. And I do this because I'm very friendly and open to collaborations, and if there are things that are of interest either in what I've said already or in the new directions that we're pursuing, please do get in touch, and my email will be on the last slide. So some of the new research directions are that we were surprised to learn in doing the evaluation of the experience of people, both in telling their stories in NEON, the recorded stories we've got, and the impact of those stories on other people, how common post-traumatic growth is in people living with psychosis. So many of you will know that there is a strong evidence base that trauma and psychosis are linked. One empirical piece of evidence, which I find really thought-provoking and which was more commonly known, is that if I were to ask people on the call how likely you think it is that smoking causes lung cancer, my guess would be most people would say yes, there is a direct causal link. What's less well known is that the ACEs study in America, Adverse Childhood Experiences study, has shown that the likelihood of childhood adverse experiences or trauma leading to adult psychosis, or such as schizophrenia, is the same relative risk as smoking for lung cancer. In other words, traumatized children are very vulnerable to growing up to experience psychosis and other related mental health issues. So that's bad news, because we have an under recognition of that fact, which is why there has been a growth in the call for trauma-informed services. But it's also good news because it opens up a new possibility that people may grow through that experience of trauma. And indeed, that's what we found. So we've now started a new research program called EPOC, Evaluating Positive Change, which is trying to understand the processes of post-traumatic growth for people living with psychosis, and what services might be able to do that would support that post-traumatic growth. And this, of course, links to research conducted by some of my friends and colleagues in Israel already. A second area is around institutional injustice. And this is the idea that systems, not when they have gone wrong, but when they are operating exactly as intended, harm some people, and typically harm marginalized and people from communities and groups that are already dealing with intersectional challenges. So institutional injustice has become an interest of ours as a sociological lens through which to make sense of some of the organizational culture change needed in the mental health system to move towards a rights-oriented, person-centered, recovery-focused system. And then finally, we have a developing interest in the experience of people who live with psychosis and do not use mental health services. And there's a really interesting new evidence emerging from psychiatric epidemiological studies. If you look at people using mental health services, something like, depending how it's measured, 0.7 to 1% of our population will have a lifetime diagnosis of, for example, schizophrenia. But if you do look at community surveys in a number of countries, what's clear is that the prevalence of people living with psychosis-like experiences is much higher. One study found 7%, another study found 13%. My sense is probably the reality is something like 1 in 100 of our citizens in our community have a diagnosed psychosis such as schizophrenia, but 1 in 10 live with psychosis-related or psychosis-like experiences. So trying to learn what is different, if anything, and what is it that means the person can cope without mental health support, and when and for whom is that mental health support more or less useful? Those are questions in a new research program we're starting called Ensure, which is very much more focused on people living outside of mental health services who have an experience of psychosis. So that's some of our future directions. That's the end of what I've got to say. So as I say, please do get in touch individually if anything I've said is of interest. But beyond that, I very much welcome the chance to have a dialogue now after my talk. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you, Mike. I think maybe we can close the presentation now so we can get a sense through the Zoom, even though it's challenging, of the crowd we have here. I encourage people to at least open up your cameras. And we are happy to take questions, comments to this, again, so inspiring talk, Mike. I don't know how you do it. It's like you manage to touch on that thing we all want to change at so many levels, from the individual all the way to the wide system, and using the most updated technologies, making it really, really inspiring to think about this next step of citizenship. And really, you know, the association for me is what we always use as participatory action research models, how we want to get the knowledge from experience more and more into what we do. And it's, I think what you're suggesting here is huge and so important, and really taking it to the next step. And I'm sure all these projects and different initiatives you've just conceptualized so clearly must entice some thought and comments on people's side. And thank you for also opening up for new collaborations. So if anyone wants to say something, ask a question, see how some of the topics Mike was talking about resonate with our state of the mental health institutions in Israel, the services we work in, the way we work with people with knowledge from experience, and how perhaps some of the things Mike talks about kind of take it to the next step, broader, outside of the system. Not a lot of the times we have that problem that we're kind of talking to ourselves all the time, how we can take it up outside to wider circles. You are welcome to either raise a hand using that icon or write in the chat box. I currently only see like this line of
just while people are thinking, on
yes,
that
Mike,
point,
please.
on that point, Galia,
Yes.
in the citizen science study, we've really had to grapple with questions of power and who is in charge. So the approach we are taking is that we have a research team, and they provide one part, the knowledge, one part of decision making, but we also have 11 partner organizations that we work with who bring various aspects of knowledge to the table, and that for us is working very well. And we've carefully chosen those partners to be very diverse. So partners include the NHS Confederation, which is the organization in England that is overseeing and managing all of the statutory mental health service, so very much embedded in the system, through to partners such as NSUN, the National Survivor User Network, which is primarily an oppositional service user activist forum. And we've had to use real kind of interpersonal skills to hold a space which is safe enough for a diverse group of stakeholders to be supporting the process of co-developing knowledge. And it is a challenge. There's no two ways about it. I can see why it's easier to just retreat into being a researcher talking to other researchers, because there are more shared assumptions there. It's just an easier conversation, but my sense is that we've now reached the limits of what we can learn from researchers talking to other researchers. So the next frontier is that co-production of knowledge, and over time moving towards knowledge to led approaches. And it's exciting times. I mean, many people on the call will know the emergence of new academic disciplines like survivor research and MAD studies as new bodies of knowledge emerging, which give primacy to lived experience. So in that sense, I think we do live in genuinely changing times.
Yes, and it's interesting that as you're saying that, we get exactly a question related to that, as Slade is asking about this discrepancy, which we also sense here between rehabilitation services and the psychiatric system as a whole. Slade, I assume you are talking more about the gap between rehabilitation services in the community and the psychiatric medical institutions in Israel. If you can open your mic and talk, or you can write up. Hi, Slade. Slade is a mental health worker and an MA student at our mental health track at Ben-Gurion University, and a long time practitioner with a lot of expertise in the religious area and promoting the recovery in those services. Yes.
Yes, so that was my question, because it's something that we encounter a lot in Israel, at least. The difference, even though slowly there have been shifts also in the medical psychiatric area, but there still is a very large difference between those two aspects. So I was wondering if you could maybe relate to that also.
Sure, that's really helpful. Nice to meet you. I'm very sorry I have no Hebrew, just for people on the call may feel more challenged to speak in English, so my apologies for that. What a great question. A few observations. It is, I think, an old preoccupation about which group or system or service structure or profession should be dominant. So, like yourself, I'm sure, I've lived through many debates about, hospital versus community care, and around, the role, if any, of institutions, around rehabilitation versus traditional hospital-based outpatient clinics, the kind of services that should or shouldn't be provided. And more recently, debates about, different professional groups and which group should be in charge of which bit, and should we have multidisciplinary teams, or should each profession work in a separate way, and different countries have different traditions and so forth. So all of that debate is, of course, going on internationally and still very much goes on. I think that's the old debate. I think that misses the point. I think a genuinely transformed service would not start with what's the right system. It would start with, we've got various types of expertise within our system. What's the best way of wrapping that system around each person who needs to use the system? And that leads to very different kind of formulations of what a future service might look like. So in some ways, I guess I'm proposing that, yes, there is a traditional kind of gap between, in your country and mine, less so maybe, but certainly in other countries more so, between the kind of the psychiatric bit of the system and what gets framed in Israel as the rehabilitation bit, or in other countries as the kind of disability and social support bit in Australia. And so, if you're seeing a psychiatrist, you see them in one bit of the system. If you're seeing a psychologist, you see them in another bit. And if you're seeing a social worker, you see them in the third bit. And should they all be joined together? And of course, they're worth considering what's the best, kind of sensible working arrangement. But I don't think that's where the big wins are. I think the big wins are this more fundamental transformation that we were talking about from the start, around what does person-centered mean? And one of the challenges is it may have quite fundamental implications. So in an evidence-based medicine system, for example, certainly in my country, there's a strong emphasis on clinical guidelines. on the, and of course the argument is very straightforward, that it shouldn't be just who the person happens to see dictates whether they get an effective intervention or crystal therapy. There should be a kind of expectations that people provide evidence-based interventions, and that's a reasonable thing. The way that plays out in this country, at least, is that certain interventions are allowed and certain not allowed, and they are proposed as an invariant hierarchy. So you should start with this and then do this and do this. So which is immediately not very person-centered, because it takes no account of preference, for example. But then in the way that's enacted in systems is through care pathways. So we have care pathways, a set of interventions and supports that should be given to someone, and normally it's on the basis of diagnosis. So we may have a depression care pathway, we may have a psychosis care pathway, and so forth. And you can see what's happening is the individual is being twisted around to meet the needs of the system rather than vice versa. So I'm cautious about too much emphasis on thinking about how to get the system right, because that in a way can just replicate the system doing things to the person rather than the person being actually the one with the power to make decisions. So two concrete examples on that. In Western Europe, in Denmark in particular, and some of the Scandinavian countries, there's a new emerging emphasis on patient-controlled admissions. It's a whole new approach which hasn't come into the United Kingdom, or to my knowledge, Israel, very much at all at the moment, but is essentially saying an individual themselves decides when they need to be admitted to hospital. Now that's power, and that's a shift of power, which in the United Kingdom at least would not be something that could be considered. It would be seen as, out of scope, and that's where the disruptive transformation plays out. The other thing I'd say is that I think in part what we're talking about is not clinical issues, but political issues. It's issues of power, empowerment, and emancipation. And from that perspective, in organizational theory, there is a really useful saying: when the people change, the leaders will follow. So that is present in politics, but it's also present in the culture of mental health systems. And my own view is that fundamental transformation will only come when there is a coalition of individuals with lived experience and their allies to say how we're doing things is not fit for purpose. Because generally, disruptive transformation involves changing power arrangements, and no group in power willingly gives away power. That's just the nature of human groups. Individuals may or may not, but as a group level phenomenon, power is always taken, it is never given. And in that sense, I think there's a politics aspect to your question as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mike. And as you speak, we have already 4 more questions and 15 more minutes, at least formally, although we can continue beyond that. So thank you so much. Daphna Yeshua Katz has asked to ask a question. Daphna, a colleague.
Hi, yes, thank you.
From our department. Hello.
Hello, thank you for the interesting talk. I was very excited to hear about the implementation of citizen science in mental health. And I just came back from a conference where they discussed you raised the question of power. In that conference, they raised the question of power in citizen science, and especially safety. So what is your point of view about examining the safety of information? I mean, the information about masses of people that report about the mental health, share the mental health status is being kept in servers that may be vulnerable, or what is your view about that, about the safety and the idea that corporate servers are being involved in mental health research?
That's a really great question. Thank you, Daphna. The where we've got to is we've identified a number of very specific, concrete things that need to be attended to. I suspect there won't be a single answer to them, but here are the issues we think are particularly raised by citizen science in mental health. The first is data. And the information governance expectation. So, for example, how secure is the data? For example, who owns the data? And for example, with whom is that data shared? Now, I think there won't be a simple or single answer to that because it will vary across projects. I mean, if I'm asking someone for their sleep patterns, that might be the kind of data that in aggregated anonymized form is more sensible to share than if I'm asking people about their experience at a particular hospital, which might have other kind of issues to consider. So it's unlikely there'll be one single solution, but that's an important area. A second is around capacity and safeguarding issues. And here, I think where we are likely to land is, this is one deviation from traditional citizen science. I think we are going to be recommending that informed consent processes, just as for any other online study, should be used in citizen science and mental health studies. So that's different to traditional practice in other topics. But we also shouldn't discriminate by, for example, one proposal has been to require some kind of assessment with the individual before they can sign up. That makes it harder for individuals with mental health issues compared to other citizens to sign up, and that's discrimination. So where we're going to land is that the processes involved in completing the informed consent form in themselves demonstrate an ability to understand information, and we're working with our partners to make sure that balance is right. But we don't want to swing too far the other way to making it more difficult, because that's discrimination. But we also do think extra safeguards are needed in terms of participant safety, because some people may be more vulnerable or lack capacity to make informed decisions. And then the third aspect, which is specific to mental health, we think needs considering, is communication between citizen science contributors. So if the project is about counting, bird calls, what time in the morning they are, it's common that there will be an online forum where individuals can say, oh, my, Robin started at 6:10 and my Robin started at 6:15. Isn't that interesting? Where do you live? Oh, I'm a bit further north. Maybe that's different. Those kind of conversations. We know that there are potential benefits, but also potential harms that arise from online support forums relating to mental health. So some of the potential benefits I don't need to rehearse, but some of the potential harms include, for example, trolling or bullying or obtaining people's confidential information and so forth. So we need to be more thoughtful in citizen science projects relating to mental health when we're allowing citizen science contributors to communicate with each other, which might be either deciding not to allow that or a moderated forum approach where responses are moderated by someone. But of course, that's more labor intensive. So that's some of the balance. Does that answer what you're asking?
Thank you, Mike. One thing that they recommended in the conference is to include data governance section in the informed consent. So explicitly telling the subject what is being done with the information later on and what is being done with the digital ID as well.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah. So certainly, I mean, that's consistent with data protection legislation, that people know what the data will be used. But also, it was interesting, the slide I showed earlier about the data sharing really hasn't taken off yet as a normal custom and practice, and we'll be recommending that the data sharing agreement be visible to others. So it not be just some private document held by the study team, but actually aiming for transparency about how the data will be used, because there are real issues for all of us about the use of our personal data that I suspect will become a growing issue over the years. Nothing to do with mental health, but just big data generally.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Mike and Daphna. Gadi Rosenthal, head of family nonprofit organization, would like to ask a question. Gadi, Taya, if you can bring Gadi Rosenthal up.
Thank you very much for a very illuminating lecture. I would like to ask your opinion about the role or the place of families in your concept.
Thank you. So I guess where I would start with that question is acknowledging that there has been a traditional problem in mental health systems around the world, so not particularly Israel or the United Kingdom, but certainly in both our countries as well as other countries, that family members are neither valued nor supported. So they're not valued. The system thinks it's the system job to fix the person, and the family member is just in the background rather than actually being an active contributor to the person's lives, and not supported. So I've heard too many carers and family members say they aren't told anything by their worker about their loved one because of confidentiality concerns and so forth. So I think family members have not had a good deal from the traditional approach in the mental health system. In terms of into the future, I think, you know, that's an area that may well emerge as knowledge 3. That's an area that may well emerge. I mean, it's not, for me, it's not, you know, if I'm honest, it's not my passion. My passion is knowledge 2, but I think knowledge 3, the idea of developing an understanding from the perspective of other people's in centrally involved in the individual's life, is probably yet another new frontier. One of the, you probably know some approaches like open dialogue and trialogues are looking to build in that understanding, that knowledge 3, if we call it that, more centrally to make it visible and informing decision making and better supported and so forth. But I think there is a long journey to go on that particular road.
Thank you.
I must add here, being both personally a professional and also family member, that your idea, Mike, of knowledge 3 speaks very much to me, even though my passion is also in knowledge by expertise. And I think this ties into a question of our head of the department, Professor Orly Sarid. Would you like to, you had a question, would you like to ask it, or I could tie it in?
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Thank you very much, Mike. My question is, you have a multi-level perspective for different types of intervention. And I was wondering, how do you tailor it to different culture, collectivistic, individualistic, feminine-oriented, masculine-oriented?
Thank you. That's a great question, and one I'm really interested in. I mean, my own view is I am deeply suspicious of invariant solutions. The idea that some problem of humanity, some challenge that of living has one solution and we just need to find it. I'm very, very suspicious of that worldview. And yet that is a worldview embedded in traditional mental health systems. So for example, when we do systematic reviews and meta-analysis, we are trying to find the answer, the single estimate of how effective an intervention is, for example. And I just don't buy that as a paradigmatic assumption. So, you know, using the language of health research, of course, we need cross-cultural validity and so forth. But I think it's actually a deeper thing, that we need homegrown solutions and innovations where it's not just a question of taking something developed in another space and refining it to make it work here. It's about supporting innovation in all of these spaces. And the problem when there is a strong central focus on the mental health system is it doesn't harness that innovation. So for example, there are resulting blind spots. So CHIME framework, I've been really pleased that more collectivist cultures, which were not so present in the data we drew on to develop the CHIME framework, have really challenged the idea of empowerment. So in collectivist cultures, there is much less of a positive valorization, a positive valuing of empowerment than there is in individualistic cultures. So in, you know, the American dream, or in United Kingdom, be the person you want to be, and that's all brilliant, and empowerment is a good thing. In collectivist cultures, some people experience empowerment as being disloyal to your family. And that very fundamental difference means that the CHIME framework in, you know, kind of in its simple form, is not useful in more collectivist cultures in the way that is useful in more individualistic cultures. So I've been really pleased to see extensions, changes, refinements emerging. Some, for example, suggest that CHIME has underemphasized the role of difficulty, so the CHIME D framework says we should have a balance towards difficulties. My own view is that's not needed, because that's what the mental health system does without thinking. But, you know, I'm pleased that that refinement has happened. Other more deeper transformations have been, for example, development of frameworks for relational recovery, suggesting that there needs to be a greater emphasis on our interpersonal and relationships between the individual and the state, the individual and civic societies. And I think that's great too. I mean, by background, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I have a vulnerability to over-individualize experiences. And it's great that, you know, new people are coming along and saying, actually, these are collective experiences, these are interpersonal experiences. So for me, I think I would see our research group's job, for what it's worth, in passing, as providing a first innovative knowledge offering. And the hope is that many people from many perspectives around the world take up and run with and change and refine and make it work for them. So there is nothing that is, you know, set in stone about any of the ideas. They need to be made to apply and be useful locally, and some just won't be. I mean, you know, even the language of recovery for some groups is really helpful. For some other groups, like younger people, hate the word recovery because it implies they're ill and so forth, and so that's a very unhelpful approach. Similarly, in dementia, the idea of recovery is seen as promising a false hope of getting better and back to normal, and so, you know, terms like recovery are not helpful. So neither the language nor the ideas are fixed. They are, you know, offers to the world, and the goal is that the world changes them and refines them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mike, I'm torn. There's one more question. I think actually it's going to be extremely relevant for a lot of the audience here. So I'm going to quickly say it, although we have just 3 minutes before some people will be running off to other places. But this question comes from Nomi Natan. She's a rehabilitation professional in the mental health rehabilitation system. And she's asking provocatively, I will add, what is different about what you are suggesting in terms of the science than the outcome studies, the outcome questionnaires that are being, you know, spread around the mental health rehabilitation system in Israel, you know, with David Rowe, the big project that everybody has to fill in the questionnaires about the services. What is you're suggesting different in what you're suggesting in this lecture?
Sure. So routine outcome monitoring is an area that Israel very much leads in. So it's one of the real leading spaces. And of course, it's a good thing. If we're providing taxpayer funded services, we should be looking to understand what the impact is. And routine outcome monitoring is a structured approach to doing that, which is great, and I fully support, and, you know, is a good thing. So to answer the question, what's different? Well, one example of what's different is what is being asked about. So in routine outcome monitoring, you choose a measure, and normally that's chosen by the system, with some involvement or not from other stakeholders, but normally that's a kind of system valued measure, capturing a system valued outcome domain. And then that is implemented at scale, and you get data on that. How do we know whether that outcome domain matters to the person who is being asked to complete it? Well, we don't, and we should. So one transformation would be away from judging success based on system metrics towards judging and becoming a much more sophisticated at assessing and monitoring personally valued goals. And that's really challenging, because for one person, their goal may be not having their symptoms. So that's fine. There's a nice, easy, off-the-shelf outcome measure we can do for that. But for another, it may be reconnecting with their family, which is a much more difficult thing to measure. For another, it may be developing their survivor mission. That's what they want to do to develop eudaimonic well-being, for life to have meaning, is that they want to make sure no one else goes through what they've gone through. Now, that's an important quest in life, which has led to many civil rights activists and many societal changes through the ages, but it's very difficult to capture as a measure. So one tangible difference would be how we judge success, moving from a focus on system priorities towards a focus on the individual's priorities.
Thank you. I think this couldn't be a clearer answer. I want to, can we take maybe, say goodbye to everybody who needs to go to run to classes. This is a university schedule we're on. And thank here at this point, Mike, for those leaving, but also ask you, Mike, and other audience interested, because I do see that there are more questions coming in, to stay maybe 10 more minutes and collect 1 or 2 more questions before we end, okay?
Lovely to meet you all.
Yeah, this just shows you how much your talk speaks to a lot of people here. Leon, would you like to raise your thoughts, your comments? You're welcome. Leon Gaini.
Yes, hi, Mike. Thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting. And I'm thinking about the last question about just adding some view from a service user view, which I think מדדי תוצאה, which the name of the assessment that we need to do in the rehabilitation service, is like another מטלה, משימה.
Another task.
Another task
thing to do.
That someone tells you to do. It's had nothing to do with empower the service user. It has the meaning it has, but I think the regular thinking that if you are not doing it, you might not getting the service or some power issue, just make the power issue more big. It's not thing that come from the people, which is very, very not the same about the other thing that you said in your lecture. So I just wanted to add this.
Thanks, Leon. Nice to see you again. So yeah, no, it's a very good question. I mean, from my perspective, I think there is a role for routine outcome monitoring using the same measures across large groups of people, because it's very difficult otherwise to aggregate and say things about the system and so forth. So I think there is a role, but I think you quite rightly raise a couple of issues. One is, I suppose, the issues that I've touched on already of how much does what we're asking about matter to the person. The other is the power issue of compulsion. If someone feels they won't get a good service if they don't complete it, or probably what's more common, they feel they won't get a good service if they don't complete it and show that it's very positive. Those are genuine issues and mean that, we're kind of relying on bad data to make decisions, and that can never be a smart thing, as well as the individual's experience of more power being taken away, which is clearly not a good thing. So, I mean, my personal view is that we over time need to move towards a system which is more focused on a structured, so a very tangible thing that you can say you've done or not done, approach to understanding what the person's goals in life are. Now, for some people, it's very helpful to frame that as goals. Some people like goals. Some people don't like goals at all. So that we need to have a language that respects that some people are more focused on just the journey of life and being and becoming and belonging than achieving. So being mindful of that. But most people can say something about their hopes and what they dream of, what would be a better life, what the things that they want in their life that may not be there at the moment. And there are approaches, so structured approaches like goal attainment scaling. Our group has developed an approach called individual plus primary outcome, which is for use in randomized controlled trials, where you show an individual a number of domains of life which span both traditional clinical priorities like symptoms or functioning or staying out of hospital, but also more citizenship-oriented domains like participating in society or having an intimate partner or having a job or exploring my spirituality, or things that many of us would identify as central to our well-being. And the individual identifies the domain that matters most to them, and behind each domain there is a carefully chosen standardized measure. So in evaluating an intervention, each participant fills in a different primary outcome measure, but they're all standardized measures. So, and we've published this as a methodology which has been used in some other trials to try and individualize the choice of primary outcome in evaluation context. For routine practice context, my suspicion is that where we need to get to is more of a focus on individual goal setting and goal support, which is a way of showing your voice matters. It's a way of saying what matters to you is our job. It's not peripherally related to our job. It is our job. And, you know, that can be very challenging. I work with an organisation in New Zealand that was using strengths model, which is a, you know, established social worker model for amplifying strengths. And they were saying some of the challenges are the goals individuals set for themselves can be very non-clinical. The one I remember was someone had a goal of swimming with dolphins. And, you know, so they bit the bullet and they said, okay, that's our job as a mental health service to support this person to swim with dolphins. So they did lots of, you know, kind of work up, building confidence, lots of preparation, working out the costing, finding a way of paying for it, well, you know, logistics of travel. So all the life skills that presumably are good things to acquire, but acquired in the service of the person's goals. I met the person, her face lit up as she told me about her experience of swimming with dolphins. And you could not find a more positive person about the service than this person. So, you know, if we have anyone on the call who struggles with issues of engagement or, you know, treatment resistance or difficult to reach people, it may be because we're just not offering what people want.
Wow,
Thanks.
thank you. One last question, perhaps, from people here. We're becoming a smaller and more intimate crowd. This is the time to dare and ask. I know there might be one last question.
You sound like an auctioneer, Galia.
Yes, because I know
going.
that this is a gold mine. They don't understand. This is the chance. Mike is so open and generous and answering questions, and I think his answers are always sort of crossing the barriers, and also I think it's amazing how we come back to the core things again and again. And in your presentation, you are taking us to such new fields to act and operate in. So if anybody wants to ask anything, this is the last bid. This is the last call of the bid. Going once, going twice. Okay, so I guess we'll let it come to an end here. And Mike, I want to really thank you so much for being with us here today and having this presentation and inviting people to come in and join. We do have your email address, and this lecture is being recorded and will be published so people can have the contact information with you if they have any more questions. And for many more years of collaboration and promoting the similar goals that we have.
Wonderful. Thank you all very much for your attention. I've really enjoyed dialoguing with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.